Good morning and welcome to today's open lectures at Jönköping University. Today, the day before the formal academic ceremony, we will give you an opportunity to listen to lectures given by our 4 new honorary doctors. To award them an honorary doctorate is a symbol of our appreciation of their important achievements for Jönköping University and our research areas. When I looked up what Wikipedia says about honorary doctorate, I read that an honorary degree is an academic degree for which a university has waived all of the usual requirements, such as matriculation, attendance, course credits, a dissertation, and the passing of comprehensive examinations. However, I was a little bit afraid of telling you that, the honorary doctors for today, because it seems like some of you new honorary doctors missed that part and made an academic career before you got this award. But when it comes to the first honorary doctor, she seems to, at least, have done a part of her academic career outdoors. So I welcome Associate Professor Per Askelund from School of Education and Communication to introduce the first honorary doctor today.
It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker today, Honorary Dr. Sue Waite. Sue Waite is absolutely one of the most prominent researchers in the field of outdoor learning internationally. Until recently, Sue was employed as a reader in outdoor learning at Plymouth Institute of Education at Plymouth University. And currently, she is affiliated as a reader emerita in outdoor learning. Since several years, Sue is also a collaborator and a very good friend to me and several of my colleagues at School of Education and Communication. The title of Sue's talk today is Nature's Turn. I very much look forward to listening to this. Welcome, Sue.
Hello everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me okay. And thank you, Uli and Per, for that very warm and kind introduction. And the chance to get along very briefly with Joni Mitchell there. It seems extraordinary and a little scary that that record was released in 1970 and yet still has such resonance over 50 years later. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. I'm delighted and honoured to be invited to speak about some of my research interests and personal passions regarding our relationship with nature on the occasion of being awarded an honorary doctorate at Jönköping University. What I propose to do this morning is to share some personal images of nature while I'm talking that I hope will trigger some memories and ideas about how you regard nature. But first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I arrived at this point. My parents worked in special education for children with emotional and behavioural difficulties in the 1960s. At that time, the usual practice in the UK was for children moved from contexts, both school and home, that were seen as potentially contributing to their difficulties. And they were sent to residential schools where they lived during term times. These schools were often old manor houses in the countryside with extensive grounds, and my family lived on site. Without a clear rationale for why they might be important, these places with outdoor spaces provided a therapeutic context for many children. And I was really fortunate to share that early experience of nature. It has influenced my attachment to and advocacy for the natural environment ever since. There's now a massive evidence that shows that time spent in green and blue spaces, for example, urban parks, natural landscapes, gardens, by rivers, or indeed in them, lakes and the sea. And that's what I mean by nature and natural environments. But these are beneficial for human health and well-being. The effects on people's sense of subjective well-being have been shown to be as significant as if they were healthier and wealthier. This means that even with continuing social injustices, some cumulative negative impacts can be mitigated if people have opportunities to access nature. And this access to nature might be in very small urban parks or amongst wilder landscapes, although higher levels of biodiversity have been linked to better outcomes. However, just as many of the children attending my parents' residential school were from inner cities with little opportunity to spend restorative time in nature within their home communities, the inequalities of access persist today, so that families from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and minority ethnic groups are less likely to visit natural environments, according to surveys in England. Cultural differences can act as barriers to engagement with nature, and this is often because there are dominant views about what engagement with nature should look like. In a recent study that I was involved in with the National Centre for Social Research in England, we found that a lack of diversity in the staff in nature-focused organisations in England could lead to culturally different understandings of nature being excluded. And through this, a lower uptake of opportunities to lower income and ethnic minority groups to spend time in nature. This, combined with poorer quality green space in areas of deprivation, contributed to restrictions in the potential for health and well-being through nature in these communities. And a similar situation has been noted elsewhere, for example, in the US. Greater involvement in the local community in planning and developing urban green space appears to help to bridge this gap. But nevertheless, still some families feel nervous and reticent about using unfamiliar green space. My interest in school-based outdoor learning is a response to that gap in accessibility. Ensuring an entitlement to outdoor learning through provision of these experiences in educational settings can help all children gain access to nature. Exposure to nature during the early years tends to lead to a greater attachment to and care about the environment in later life. For example, in one study that colleagues and I did at the University of Plymouth, children who planted trees in their primary school years developed more pro-environmental attitudes, which remained observable when they were in secondary education to those who had not had this experience. And what is more, their care for nature had been modified and reinforced by subsequent educational input. They experienced a sense of well-being from having taken action to make a positive difference to the world. There are, of course, cultural differences across as well as within countries. Scandinavian countries appear to be fortunate in that there seems to be a greater expectation of spending time in nature, often called friluftsliv. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, or open air life, that has been eroded in many Western cultures since industrialization. Nature kindergartens are quite widespread, and udeskola, teaching outside the classroom, is supported at both grassroots and policy levels. The educational systems in Scandinavia seem to embed learning outside the classroom to a greater extent than many other countries, both through these grassroots movements and policy frameworks. For example, the inclusion of outdoor learning in the early years biology and physical education curricula in Sweden. In addition, this appears complemented by political support for the natural environment. For example, Sweden topped the Global Green Economy Index in 2014 for moving to a more sustainable economy. For many people in developing countries, their livelihood collide with nature as it is both a necessary resource and a volatile threat, practicing subsistence farming in increasingly challenging climatic circumstances, for example. Nevertheless, despite these widely ranging diverse circumstances, there is growing interest in outdoor learning across many countries of the world for a variety of reasons or purposes. These purposes have recently been identified in an international study as predominantly about children's health and well-being, developing social, confident and connected people, and developing care for others and the environment. And what many countries that were involved in that survey reported as most valuable and outstanding, in which school-based outdoor learning could deliver many positive outcomes and desired student outcomes for the 21st century simultaneously. I hope you're enjoying the images, because even virtual nature has been shown to be beneficial for well-being. But let's now turn to consider how nature's influence on positive outcomes for health and well-being happens. And there are several theories that seek to explain this. Biophilia, for example, refers to an innate attraction that humans have to natural contexts based on an evolutionary perspective. And this is used to explain an observed preference for semi-open grassed areas with some shrub cover and for trees that spread their branches, supposedly echoing memories of the savanna and the optimum conditions for survival in our evolutionary past. Attention restoration theory draws on a psychological perspective and explains nature's attraction through its capacity to offer us soft fascination. We can be absorbed by gazing at landscapes or natural things, but our attention is effortless. We are simply in the moment. Having spent time in nature, we are then able to concentrate better on arduous tasks of modern life. More recently, research has shown that plant emissions include chemicals that contribute to human health. Immersive experiences of water can also raise serotonin levels, the feel-good factor in our bodies. So practices like green exercise, cold water swimming, and forest bathing, sitting beneath or passing through trees are all increasingly recognized as beneficial for physiological reasons. Green prescriptions, whereby a doctor refers a patient to a program of outdoor activity, are becoming more widely used to support mental health and recovery from stress-related and cardiovascular diseases. Kellett in 2002 proposed developmental stages for our relationship to nature, beginning between 3 to 6 years with dominionistic, negativistic, and utilitarian attitudes. And these refer to mastery and control, fear and alienation from nature, and exploitation of nature, respectively. Moving between 6 to 12 years to humanistic, aesthetic, symbolic, and scientific attitudes, meaning respectively emotional attachment to, appreciation of the beauty of, use for thought and language, and systematic study of forms and functions of nature. And finally, developing moralistic and naturalistic attitudes, that is, respect for and ethical attitudes towards, and direct experience of nature between 13 to 17 years. However, colleagues and I have challenged this proposed sequence, suggesting instead that children enter the world with innate naturalistic and aesthetic attitudes to the more than human world. And you just have to think of what babies put into their mouths to taste and test. And they learn negativistic responses through adults' reactions to their exploration. Between 3 and 6 years, we suggest, they begin to develop humanistic and moralist attitudes about what is right and wrong to do to others, including creatures and other living things, with adult guidance. And they begin to learn symbolism through naming of their world. During the later years of schooling, they learn scientific approaches and a more dominionistic attitude of power over nature, which we suggest tends to culminate in a utilitarian view of what nature can do for humans. Admittedly, both these perspectives are overwhelmingly from developed countries, Western and global North viewpoints. To a greater or lesser extent, they separate and privilege the human species over the rest of nature. And they also fail to take account of the rich belief systems of indigenous peoples across the world, where the more than human are seen as kin, part of a family that all depend on each other. Cameron and colleagues in 2021 have argued that to feel this kinship, we need to recognize the wordless way that the earth speaks to us. They acknowledge that while indigenous knowledge systems are diverse, complex, and unique, there are some common principles across them, including relationality, interconnectedness, reciprocity, and balance through a relationship with spirit and the land. Wider recognition of this mutuality is gaining momentum in the academic world, partly through post-humanist and new materialist thinking, that we are inescapably entangled within the complex networks of life on Earth, and we need to listen to and take account of what nature is telling us. But if I can just backtrack a little here to explain why I chose nature's turn as the title of my talk today. Turn has several meanings in English, and maybe you'll recognize some of them. We talk about a turn in the road where there is a change in direction. A turn is also when there is a change in who speaks, acts, or is in charge, such as in a game. It's Pear's turn now. It can also be when someone takes on a role or acts, often a set piece that an actor performs on stage. And it may also mean when there is a bad reaction to something, as in he's had a nasty turn. My title, Nature's Turn, therefore, signals that it is time for change. Humans have been performing a role as masters of the planet, trying to keep control, to plunder its finite resources, and not allowing the change in direction that is needed if nature, including us, is to thrive in the future. Even the well-meaning natural health and well-being agenda are looking for what nature can do for us. More of the general public outside academia are also recognise our need for and connection with nature. During the pandemic, there's been extraordinary demand on places of natural beauty, with crowds of urban dwellers flocking to the coastline, woodland and national parks in England when allowed to travel. Unfortunately, there have been sometimes been destroying what has been sought in the process of their rush to beauty, fresh air, headspace and serenity. Post-human theories acknowledge that nature is not a commodity that stands apart from us. We are part of nature. It is our kin. Other species and natural systems have agency and are actors too. We are completely entangled within the interdependence of life on Earth. But somehow, many of us across the globe have forgotten this and carry on as consumers with a utilitarian view of nature. Nature is seen as a resource that is there to serve us. It has been human beings' turn for a long time, although it's really a blink of an eye in geological time. But their effects on the Earth have been so marked over that period that scientists have named it the Anthropocene. Our actions have released vast amounts of carbon and extracted resources, including forests, adversely affecting the climate. Extreme weather is now the norm. The pandemic has demonstrated our vulnerability to unexpected turns of nature, with distressing numbers of deaths and severe illness from the jump of a virus from another species and the mutations that support its spread amongst humans. On the other hand, as observed earlier, nature has also provided a powerful source of solace during the stresses of COVID and a safer environment for many human activities. So what might we learn from our growing awareness that we are within nature? Some recent acknowledgement that humans cannot be separated from nature comes with the danger that hybridization of culture-nature, all one word, places culture, us, still in the position of power. Fremo, for example, contends that eco-modernists assume that there will be a human-generated solution to the situation which humans have created, that nature is in effect dead, and techno-nature, man-made and managed, is the new environmentalism which maintains our role as masters of the earth. He, however, proposes rather that our human response through new naturalism should imply a strong reflexivity through which an attitude of humility and maybe even the practice of wisdom can be cultivated and fostered. Although there is a recognition that time is running out for us if we continue to use the planet's resources so profligately, there is still a tendency to hang on to our existing and embedded human-centric attitudes. The Wildlife Trusts in England, for example, recently ran a campaign that used the tag My Nature. While this draws on the idea that a personal attachment to nature is important to develop care for it and pro-environmental attitudes, it also implies an ownership and dominion over nature, and and may therefore encourage continuation of utilitarian views. My plea today would be that instead we recognise our mutuality and interdependence, including the rights and indeed the powers of the non-human. The idea of Gaia or Mother Nature is that we are family. Indigenous perspectives involve living in balance with nature through respect for all those with whom we share the world. Another recently proposed route to giving nature its turn includes better accounting for impacts on nature and nature's value added. See, for example, the Dasgupta Review, which notes that governments almost everywhere exacerbate the problem by paying people more to exploit nature than to protect it, and to prioritise unsustainable economic activities. He suggests 3 key actions. Firstly, ensure that our demands on nature do not exceed its supply, and that we increase nature's supply relative to its current level. 2, we change our measures of economic success to guide us on a more sustainable path. And 3, that we transform our institutions and systems, in particular our finance and education systems, to enable these changes and sustain them for future generations. Formulae for assessing the value of nature are being developed, so this can be calculated to consider in making decisions that affect not just humans, but the more than human. And this might indeed help to make values more visible, and it speaks to those in powerful Western societies in a language that they understand. Although it works from within current dominant political and socio-economic mores, where humans are still the ultimate deciders, it highlights that transformation of existing measures of success and ways of living are essential. However, we cannot assume disinterest in maintaining current lifestyles. Wamser and colleagues in 2020 analysed nature-based solution programmes in several municipalities of Sweden and found that, contrary to expectations, citizen involvement was often counterproductive to achieving environmental aims and sustainability outcomes due to self-interest or lack of environmental awareness, and a failure to build in long-term participation in decision-making. What is needed, therefore, is deep-rooted changes in education and democratic governance. Fremo, and I quote, says, contrary to the anthropocentric fallacy, which regards humans in the Anthropocene as the masters and creators of nature, he contends that the Anthropocene should rather be an opportunity to rethink our place on the planet and to accept the fragility and vulnerability of the human species in the face of complex and unpredictable natural phenomena. This gesture toward planetary modesty is the only ecological option which can bring more justice into humans, interspecies, and intra-generations justice, and an improvement in the socio-economic and environmental predicament. The great challenge, he says, that lies ahead us is not the further humanization of the planet, nor its mastery, but rather the further humanization of humanity and the mastery of our mastery. A recent report about embedding well-being from Northern Ireland highlights the centrality of relationships in effective policy making. Knowing what works is important, but it is only part of the story. It is important to know how it works, and most importantly, how to use and implement what we know works. and turning that into action. This involves both hearts and minds issues in relation to green consumption and changing the way we live. Reflecting on how our actions impact differentially on parts of the world, and considering the moral issues surrounding our current way of life in developed countries and its consequences for others, humans and non-human, now and in the future. Yet unfortunately, frequently power structures and cognitive and emotional capacities required for improved democratic governance are missing. And these ingredients are all needed if we are to give nature its turn by combining greater knowledge and empathy with action. Sanson and Burke suggest that this generation of children and youth will need to change how they live, eat, work, travel, and consume in order to address climate change. But we cannot keep kicking this ball and responsibility down the road for solution by future generations. A global survey of 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25 across 10 countries reported last week that they are deeply worried about the future and climate change and frustrated by inaction by governments. Indeed, one young person said, "I don't want to die, but I don't want to live in a world that doesn't care for children and animals." And 4 out of 5 of the respondents were hesitant about having children themselves. At an individual level, recent research has identified 4 key factors to encourage youth action for the environment. And these are letting young people see their parents as engaging in pro-environmental behaviours. Secondly, parents having their own self-determined motivation to do things for the environment. Thirdly, an autonomy supporting parenting style in which parents listen to children's views and perspectives and allow them to decide things for themselves. And finally, setting expectations for pro-environmental action. Furthermore, the skills that children need to develop resilience to adversity have been identified as close relationships, psychological skills and capacities, and community-based supports. In a way, this is about retrofitting attitude change. How we as adults act now provides guidance and role modelling for how our children and grandchildren might live. Similar role modelling can be adopted by leaders in educational settings, in communities, and in politics. But quite simply, it is our responsibility as adults to act now. Research about what makes some people live in environmentally sustainable ways suggests that sustainability is seen by them as a moral issue. But it is also seen as positive in its own right. For example, participants in Weem and Madson's research claimed they enjoyed a more social and rewarding lifestyle after a change to sustainable living. These insights from research give us clear guidance about how educational systems and settings, as well as families and communities, can contribute to the much needed changes in attitudes and actions, and take up responsibility to effect transformation to give nature a fair turn. When I met members of the Sustainability Research Group from Jönköping University, they were on a study tour looking at examples of forest gardens in the south of England. Forest gardens are a form of permaculture. Their research, collegiality, and enthusiasm were infectious. I joined the Sustainability Research Group and became a visiting associate professor at Jönköping University. The group has carried out important research about developing sustainable forest gardens for schools and earlier settings. But importantly, they also actively support the wider movement for sustainability through their lifestyles and actions. And it's an absolute privilege to continue to collaborate and work with these wonderful people and to receive an honorary doctorate in recognition of our endeavours. So to summarise the main messages from what I've spoken about today, it's nature's turn. Let's be humble and let's be wise. We're part of nature and must stop putting humans first. Social justice must include environmental justice. Inequalities persist, but not only in accessing nature, but also in terms of our attitudes to nature and the more than human world. We need, in a way, to retune to our kin, to more than human species, and acknowledge both the power and fragility of nature, which will make us feel humble, but also encourage action in supporting recovery. We as adults are role models for how our children and grandchildren and future generations will live. So we need to start now and prepare our children to live differently. To do this, I suggest we need to put nature at the centre of our thinking for a sustainable world. I hope that these slides and the talk has given us some space to consider our human relationship with nature and ways that we might turn to nature and make way for nature as a whole to have its turn with due humility and wisdom as a species. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sue, for an interesting lecture, and it gave me, and I think all of the other audience also, a lot of thoughts about our future. Before I ask if there are any questions from the audience, I will address a question for myself to you. As being a grandmother, I wonder, what is the single most important thing that we can do in order to be humble and wise role models?
Yeah, thank you, Uli. I think the key thing is to use our eyes, ears and hands more and our mouth a little less. I think we, as adults, we're often very keen to say what we think should happen, say what we think somebody else should do. But I think it's about taking responsibility and acknowledging that, yes, our actions are very small, but actually it's the cumulative effect of that and the knock-on effects for the future and changes, transformation in the way that we live now and for the future that will make a difference. And one of the things that I'm slightly worried about is that things like with the pandemic and the success of the vaccination programs and so on, that this tends to puff us up as humans, make us feel that, you know, we can actually master anything, get around nature and make a difference in that way. But I think the humility is acknowledging that actually nature is a very powerful force and that, yes, we need to do things, but that we can't necessarily change these bigger patterns that are happening. So yeah, I think that's about the humility, and the wisdom is using our creativity as humans to make changes and find ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So, do we have any questions from the audience? We have one in the chat, I heard.
Do teachers and researchers observe a difference with today's digital savvy kids in the way they react with the reality of nature and outdoor learning?
So if I heard that correctly, it was about the screen time that we and children now spend in the modern world and how that impacts on our attachment to, our connection with nature. I mean, there is a great deal of concern about that, but I think, you know, we cannot turn the clock back. That's one thing that we cannot do. And technology and screens are here to stay. One of the good things is that actual virtual nature is beneficial. So even seeing nature on screens and on our TV has had an impact on children and their care for the environment. Think of David Attenborough's programs and so on, what an impact that has had in giving children knowledge about how our actions are affecting the wider world. But I think to have it actually embodied and embodied, we need to offer young children from a very early age exposure to the real world of nature, to have opportunities to feel grass, smell flowers, get into water and so on, those very visceral, embodied, sensual aspects of our attachment to nature. And there's lots and lots of research that shows that actually that exposure, repeated exposure to nature does create this attachment to and a need for spending time in nature. And spending time in nature, as I was saying earlier in the talk, has such benefits for human health and well-being, but also for care and pro-environmental attitudes. So I think, yes, you know, screens are there, but we do need as adults to provide those experiences through families, as grandmas or parents, educational settings, because as I mentioned earlier, there are huge differences in socioeconomic groups and different cultural attitudes towards being in nature that we do need to overcome.
Thank you very much, Sue. And once again, congratulations to your honorary doctorate that you will be awarded formally tomorrow. So, after a brief break, we will come back and then we will go from nature to family business, introducing our second honorary doctor. So, welcome back at 10 o'clock. Den hördes nog inte. Welcome back to these open lectures for our honorary doctorates. And now we are going to listen to the honorary doctor from Jönköping International Business School, introduced by Senior Associate Professor Massimo Bau. Welcome, Massimo.
It's my pleasure to introduce you Luis Gomez Mejia. He is the Regents Professor and Weatherup Overby Chair in Leadership at the W.P. Carey School of Business at the Arizona State University. With more than 200 papers published in the very best management journals and more than 43,000 citations, he is the father of social-emotional wealth theory and behavioral agency theory. But most importantly, he is a very good friend of us at the Center for Family Entrepreneurship and Ownership here at Jönköping International Business School. It's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Luis Gomez Mejia.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. It's an honor. And it's just wonderful to be here. So thanks, Massimo, and thanks to the people in the center. It's a great place to be. So my presentation today revolves around the concept of socio-emotional wealth that Massimo was talking about. And when we first introduced that concept, maybe 20 some years ago, we had no idea the impact it would have. And going into Google, I found recently that there are 250,000 plus citations when you put the term socio-emotional wealth as a prompt into Google. So it's amazing. And it really shows how you never know, in the end, the impact of the work that you do. What I want to do is kind of talk a little bit about the kind of the history behind the concept of socio-emotional wealth, which is used broadly now in family business studies, particularly, although some people are also using it in other contexts for other types of owners. Now, the big question that I started with a long time ago was, how does the ownership structure of the firm and the interest of the dominant owners of the firm influence firm decisions? That's the big picture question that I started with back in the 1980s, early in my career. And some of the early papers dealing with that question, for example, in 1987, we looked at executive compensation, and what we found was that the more dispersed the ownership of the firm, the more owners you had in the firm, the connection between pay and performance for the CEO was lower, weaker. CEOs received higher pay, and most of their pay was linked to the size of the company. And the argument was that when ownership was highly dispersed, the CEO had more power, and they could use that power for their own personal benefit. Okay, that was the first paper where I looked at how important ownership was. Okay, the other paper that we published in ASQ in '89, essentially what we found there was that when there was high ownership dispersion. The CEOs would hire consultants to legitimize higher CEO pay and to legitimize their own contributions to the firm. So consultants essentially served as a mechanism to justify self-serving managerial behaviors, and that would happen typically when the firm had highly dispersed ownership. Okay, so we're looking at ownership concentration in the big picture. Then, the next paper, we looked at diversification, and what we found there is that executives in firms with dispersed ownership, those companies tended to diversify more. Now, when you diversify, you get to be bigger. The bigger you are, the more prestige the CEO has, the more the CEO shows up in the mass media, and of course, the CEO also gets paid a lot more money, right? So that ownership dispersion would allow the CEO to have the discretion to diversify the firm more and therefore benefit from diversification. The whole point of all these papers is that when ownership was highly diversified, highly dispersed, the CEO would take advantage of that, and the CEO would use its discretion to pursue his own agenda, not necessarily what is best for shareholders. Okay, that was the whole point of all those papers. Those papers had nothing to do with family, by the way, right? But that was the beginning of some of these ideas, right? That ownership made a big difference. Now, in the early 2000s, I began to change the focus of some of the research, looking at the unique role of family ownership. And here in these pictures, you see multiple, companies that are well known and that are family owned. U-Haul in the United States is a moving company. So if you want to move from one apartment to another, you want to move from one house to another, a lot of people use U-Haul. Okay, it has been around for about 50 years, family firm, very successful. The other one is Kinko. It's a printing shop originally, but now they have mobile offices all over the country. Michael Dell, of course, is Dell company. It's another big one. Then you got the Galvin family from Motorola. Motorola, the big multinational firm. The Galvin family is still, one of the main drivers behind that company. And of course, they were also the founders. And then you got the Tata Group in India. It's actually, I think it's one of the top 5 multinational companies. It's an Indian conglomerate. Again, a family firm. Then the next picture here, you see Carlos Slim from Mexico. He competes with Bill Gates in terms of who's one of the richest guys, and Bezos from Amazon. And again, it's a family firm in Mexico, but very successful. He retired, now his kids took over. So, and then of course in Sweden, you got the IKEA, which is well known, all over the world. The point being is that in the early 2000s, I began to ask the question, what difference does family make when the family is the owner, right? So now what got me thinking of that was something very simple, that 95% of firms around the world are controlled by families. There are several papers in finance written in the late 90s showing that. And if you look at the United States, 85% of firms are controlled by families. That is when the family has the dominant ownership position. And when you look at the Fortune 500, which are the biggest companies in the world, 33% are controlled by families. Yeah, what was interesting to me in the early 2000s was that in contrast to those numbers, when you look at the academic literature, I couldn't find one single paper, not even one, in the so-called top-tier journals in management that specifically dealt with the role of the family. So to me, that was such a contrasting result that there is no papers, data management journals dealing with family, yet when you look at the percentages, family firms are clearly the main driver in the free enterprise system around the world. So that got me thinking, what can I do? It's an opportunity, right? Because no research has been done on this, on the family in the top tier journals. So how can I apply some of my prior work to look at the role of the family? So when I first started out doing this, I knew nothing about the family literature. This is something I learned later, but clearly it was such a contrast between the prevalence of family firms and what's available in the mainstream management journals. You will find that most of the literature in management was primarily focusing on large publicly traded companies, and they were using some of the old agency type literatures, and somehow the family was not really a focus of interest. All right, so the question that came to my mind, what difference does the family make in a company, given that the family is a predominant ownership form? Do they act differently? Do they behave differently? Do they make different strategic decisions? And to deal with those questions, I use the behavioral agency model that we created back in the late 90s, the year 2000, before I even look at the family. Okay, so the behavioral agency model had nothing to do with the family per se. It was a more generic model. And the basic argument of the behavioral agency model is that that people are loss averse. People that want to lose things. People want to protect whatever they think they own, they endow. Yeah, that's profit theory. And that challenged the agency theory argument, which argued that individuals are risk averse. So prospect theory, that came from economics, challenged agency theory by saying, wait a second, people can be risk-seeking whenever they want to prevent losses to what they already endowed. So what we did in that particular paper, we linked agency theory and prospect theory and created a behavioral agency model. And the basic argument is that people are loss averse. Depending on what's important to them, they want to protect those utilities that are important to them, and they're willing to take risks if necessary to protect those utilities that are important to them. Okay, so we use the behavioral agency model then to focus on the family. Again, the argument here is that decision makers are loss averse, and then we come up with the idea that in the case of the family owners are adverse to losing socio-emotional wealth, which is a different type of utility than purely financial wealth, which is the main concern of agency theory. Now, keep in mind that agency theory, even today, by the way, is the #1 theory use across all of the business areas: finance, accounting, economics, and even management, corporate governance, right? Even today, it's still the dominant perspective. So we're challenging the ANC argument by saying, in the case of the family, there is a non-financial type of wealth that drives their behavior, and that may be perhaps as important or more important than the financial wealth, right? So the reference point that family owners use to make decisions is to avoid losses in socio-emotional wealth, okay? Not necessarily financial wealth. And we define socio-emotional wealth as the stock of affect-related value embedded in the family firm, like identification with the firm, emotional attachment, binding social ties within the firm, the ability to appoint family members in the dynasty when the owner or the founder dies, etc. Let me go back here. So, so we developed a model where we said that in the case of the family owners, there are several elements of utilities that comprises the socio-emotional wealth. It's a paper that we published a few years back. One is the ability of the family to exercise control and influence over the firm, enjoying that control, the identification that you feel with the company, the binding social ties across family members and also with the extended family within the organization, that emotional attachment that you feel to the firm, and then the ability to renew those family bonds through dynamic succession. So in this paper, we argue that all of these factors are the components of socio-emotional wealth, and that whenever you have family owners as the primary owners of a firm, and again, going back to the statistics, those are the main, most of the companies around the world are family firms, that whenever that's the case, then they're going to be emphasizing these utilities, and they're going to make decisions to avoid losses to these utilities and to enhance those utilities as much as possible. So as you can see, these are non-financial, okay, non-financial utilities. So we developed this model a few years back. And this is all based on the literature, where we argue that when the firm is controlled by families, the preservation of socio-emotional wealth takes priority, and that affects just about every kind of firm behavior you can think of. And many papers that we wrote after this particular model basically kind of follow this outline. So that because socio-emotional wealth is so important, family firms tend to emphasize succession of family members or offsprings into the future. They tend to professionalize less because they want to have more family members in positions of control. Human resources, for example, we find that employment stability is higher in family firms. They're less likely to downsize even when the firm is having financial problems. We just have a paper where we looked at around the world. We had like 40 different countries, and even when the environment poses a lot of risk to the companies, depending on the country you're in, even then you find that family firms protect employment more than non-family, for example, right? And again, the argument we make there is that socio-emotional wealth is the driver behind that, right? Because when you fire people, when you downsize, your socio-emotional wealth suffers. Okay, emotionally, you suffer when you have to do that in a family firm. In a non-family firm, it doesn't matter, right? And part of the reason, by the way, non-family firms is that executives have a loose attachment to the company. In fact, the statistics that I saw recently is that in a non-family firm, the typical CEO lasts about 3.6 years, right? So if I'm the CEO for 3.6 years, who cares about social emotional wealth, right? I mean, that's the last thing you think about. You're making decisions with a very different perspective. In the case of the family, however, by the way, the typical CEO lasts over 17 years, 1-7, right? That changes your perspective, right? Looking at almost 20 years down the line as compared to the next 2 years, right? So, so we find that all these management processes are different when you look at the family firms. And then when you look at strategic choices, again, you find that family firms behave differently, okay? They take less risk, that's true. On the other hand, when the firm is having problems, the family firms are also willing to take risks, because by taking risk when you are having financial problems, you are protecting not only finances, but also social emotional wealth, right? And that's the paper that Massimo and I are working on right now. If the firm disappears, you lose everything. You lose not only the social emotional wealth, but you also lose the financial part of it. We also found in other papers that family firms diversify less. Okay, they diversify less than non-family. Why do they diversify less? Well, the argument we made is that when you diversify, you lose social emotional wealth. Now, why do you lose social emotional wealth? Well, because then you have to depend on other people, right? The more units you have, the more you have to hire people to manage different units. The more you have to borrow money from the banks, so then you begin to lose control, right? So we found, very clearly, and there are other papers that look at that as well, that diversification is lower when families are in control, even among the largest companies. Okay, we even look at the top Fortune 1000 firms. Even there, when there's a dominant family firm, they're less likely to diversify. And when they do diversify, they tend to go into related areas that they know relatively well. They don't go into undiversified areas where they don't really know those different businesses. So they tend to go into more related diversification. We also found, these are different papers, by the way, international diversification. Family firms tend to diversify less. And one reason is that when you diversify internationally, you begin to lose your emotional wealth. Why? Because you have to depend on people from different countries who are now members of the family. Okay, so they're reluctant. And also, when they diversify, when they do diversify internationally, they tend to go into culturally related regions that are more culturally related to the home company. Okay, generally, right? And that's why you find, for example, a lot of the Spanish companies. Where are they? Are they in the United States? No, most of them are Latin America, right? So you've got that cultural relatedness factor. And again, we argue that social emotional wealth is one of the reasons why that happens, right? Because you got that emotional attachment, you got that closer identification, you got better control when you know the culture. The more distant the culture, the more difficult it is to control the different units of the organization. We have another paper looking at acquisitions. And again, we find that family firms are less likely to acquire other companies as compared to the non-family. And the reason is the same, that the argument is that the more you acquire, the more difficult it is to sustain that social emotional wealth. Debt, on the paper, we look at, we find that family firms are less likely to engage in debt, because the more debt you engage in, the more dependent you become on whoever is giving you the money, the banks or the institutional investors, whoever it may be, right? So they tend to use more internal capital. if they can, for growth rather than debt, right? And then, accounting choices, believe it or not, are also affected by whether or not the firm is family-owned or not. If it's non-family, you find more accounting manipulation. You find more smoothing, for example, accounting smoothing things. And the argument is that family firms, they try to protect their socio-emotional wealth, and they're, because of that, they're less likely to engage in accounting manipulation, okay? And there are 2 or 3 papers actually showing that. Now, clearly, all these behaviors, so you got empirical findings, and these are the ones I'm talking about. You got empirical findings, and then you got the explanation for the empirical findings. And what's clear from all the empirical findings, and there are hundreds of papers on this now, is that family firms are a different type of animal, a different species of animal than non-family, okay? Whether you look at diversification, internationalization, debt, accounting, no matter what you look at, you find that they behave differently. And so emotional wealth, the idea there is to use that theory as a way to explain why they are different, okay? Organizational governance, you also find differences. The board in family firms is different than the board in non-family firms. The board in family firm, tend to be generally controlled by the family. Even the biggest companies, like Microsoft, you're likely to have some members of the family. I think Bill Gates' father was in the board, for example. You're likely to have family members in the board. And as a matter of fact, some of the papers define a family firm as having 2 or more members of the family sitting on the board, right? So the board has a different function. You also find more affiliate directors in the board. And these are other companies that have businesses with the company, okay? And they tend to sit on the board. They're called affiliate directors. So the board membership, the board structure is also different in family versus non-family. Incentive alignment, several papers also show that typically the family firms tend to rely less on incentives. They rely less on stock options. They rely less on bonuses as compared to non-family, okay? They tend to be much more skeptical of the role of money, so to speak, to incentivize the right behaviors, okay? And then the agency contracts in the family firm also tend to be more informal. And then there are several papers now looking at stakeholder relationships and stakeholder management in family firms. Stakeholders are more important in family firms. There are several papers showing corporate social responsibility being better in family and non-family. Those are the empirical findings. Now, how do you explain that? Well, the argument that we had in several papers is that because of emotional wealth is important to the family, for them, having a good relationship with the community, having a good image in the community, having a good relationship with people who are impacted by the firm, all those things become important because they tend to enhance socio-emotional wealth, okay? They improve your identity, they make you feel better emotionally, they make you, identify better with the firm. So in the family firm, you find that socio-emotional wealth drives a lot of the stakeholder relationship, okay? So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that clearly, across many, many different dimensions, hundreds of papers show that family firms behave differently than non-family. Then how do you explain that? Well, that's what socio-emotional wealth as a model, as a theory that we developed, try to explain what's behind it. Mainly that they are driven by a different set of utilities and the non-family firms, and that affects just about everything the company does, Now, the other question at the very end here is the financial performance. Does that mean that family firms perform worse than non-family because they emphasize social emotional wealth? Ironically, the answer is that no, they perform better, surprisingly. Okay, on average, they perform better, right? So somehow, even when they emphasize non-financial utilities, somehow in the end, they tend to perform better. Okay, so on average, right? So that means that socially, it has some important benefits, and that in terms of efficiency, or economic efficiency, or or economic well-being, you will find that somehow they manage to do better. Okay, which is important not only for the company but also for society in general. And so what you see here, I won't go into, obviously, into all these papers, but again, I just wanted to show you briefly how some of the things that we just talked about in that model, again, there are multiple papers over time that look at those different types of dependent variables or firm outcomes. Just to give you flavor for some of the research. The first one that we published was in 2001. We had the whole database of Spanish newspapers going back 50 years. And in that particular paper, what we found is that when the newspaper was doing poorly, typically the family director of the newspaper did not get fired. The editor who was not a family member was the one who got fired. So that the family tried to protect the family members, and that and typically the family director of the newspaper would last 7 years after the newspaper was having problems. Okay, so again, the argument there was that somehow there was a mechanism that was not financial that was driving some of these decisions. The other paper, 2003, we look at executive compensation in family-controlled firms, and again, what we found there is that family firms are less likely to rely on incentives. And now, in that particular paper, by the way, we're looking at Fortune 1000 firms. So we're looking at big companies now. So even when you look at the biggest companies, you find that family ownership makes a difference, right? And by the way, when we talk about family ownership in the big companies, typically you don't find 100% ownership. But what the research shows is that even over 5%, even if you own 5%, that gives you a lot of power, right? So if the family owns even 5% of those companies, that gives the family a lot of power, right? You don't have to have 100% ownership, right? So even 5% can make a big difference. Now, the other paper that I want to maybe take a little bit more time is the one in 2007, social emotional wealth and business risk. In this case, we used olive oil mills in a province of Spain, in Jaén, Spain. And it was an interesting paper in that the whole idea came about in a conference that we had in Mexico City. And we're sitting around the table having tequila, and one of the people in the Jose Moyano, who was sitting on the table, said, he had access to this data on cooperatives, farm co-ops in the Jaén. I said, well, I don't know anything about co-ops, but let's talk about it. So let's see what that data looks like. He said, yeah, you got these co-ops, and the co-ops, by law, going back 100 years in Spain, get lots of support from the government. You get tax breaks, where you pay much lower taxes. You get guaranteed prices for your farm products. you get technical support, you got marketing support, so you get all these benefits, and these are legally required benefits. And on top of that, by law, the co-op cannot deny a farmer entry. So if you wanted to be a member of the co-op, they had to accept you by law. I mean, that's part of the deal, right? So the co-op couldn't deny you entry. So I said, well, that's kind of interesting. So I said, can we get data on the family ownership of these farmers? Because some are bigger farmers, bigger farms and smaller farms. So yeah, we can get the family thing. Well, what we found in that particular paper was very interesting, is that if the farm was owned by the family, they were less likely to join the co-op. So the question came to my mind, I mean, why would anyone be crazy to turn down all these great benefits, right? Well, we went down there, we interviewed a bunch of these farmers, and the answer came back clearly. If you join the co-op, you lose control. Then the co-op will have a lot of control over your operations. Okay, the co-op can tell you what to do. The co-op has a CEO elected by the members of the co-op. So they say, we don't want to lose control. We want the family to keep control of the farm, right? So here again, I mean, that's what we came up, use the term access to emotional wealth, that somehow they were prioritizing something else besides the financials, right? And that was a clear case where it was not the decision of the co-op to deny you entry or to allow you to enter. They had to accept you. So it had to be a voluntary decision on the part of the farmer. And so that's where the whole thing behind. I mean, that's what we, that's when we first used the term of emotional wealth. There had to be some utilities there that are non financial, and we have, in a way, clear proof. I mean, as clear as we can possibly get that that people, these owners, family owners, are driven by a different set of utilities than non-family ones. All right, and then the other papers, the one in 2009 and 2010, were looking at pollution. Okay, and we use data from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, data from the United States. And the question in all these papers was, does family ownership make a difference when you look at polluting companies? Do they pollute more or less? And what we found there, the empirical finding, is that family firms pollute less, particularly when the firm is concentrated in a local area, okay? We're talking about big companies, we're talking about chemical companies, we're not talking about small, mom and pop operations here, we're talking about big companies. And what we find there is that when family owners are important in terms of the ownership, the pollution is a lot lower, okay? So there we show the importance of emotional wealth in terms of a stakeholder relationship, okay? Why? Because when you pollute, you lose, emotionally hurt you because you're polluting your environment. The image of the company suffers, your own image suffers, right? Your identification with the company is not as positive. So therefore, I mean, that's the argument, okay? The empirical finding is that they pollute less, but the theoretical argument is that the reason they pollute less is because they have all the utilities, okay? If it's no family, who cares? I mean, you pollute the environment, you can do the minimum that you have to do legally, but again, in 3 years, I'm leaving, so as a CEO, I mean, so, that's not that becomes a secondary thing, right? So, again, these are all the papers. As you can see, there's a bunch of papers looking at a whole variety of different behaviors and strategic decisions. Obviously, I cannot get into all these papers, but the point of all these papers is that when you look at a multiple set of behaviors and strategic decisions, family firms do behave differently. And this is true whether you're looking at small companies, whether you look at, like farms, or whether you look at, the chemical industry, whether you look at Fortune 500 firms or Fortune 1000 firms, you will find that almost always, the family ownership variable makes a difference, no matter what you look at. So just for another example, here, paper with Francesco, Karen Hellstadt and Matthias, just to give you an example, because they're here in the center, some of them. We find that when the family firm has to exit the business, when you exit the business as a family, your first priority is to merge with other companies. Second priority is to liquidate the company, and the third one is to sell the company empirically. Empirically, that's what we find. Now, why would you merge when you're exiting the business? Well, we made the argument, when you merge with another company, you're still keeping some of the socio-emotional wealth genes, so to speak, that remains in a merger situation. Okay? You don't want to sell the company because then you lose that identity that you created over many, many years. So you prefer to even liquidate over selling. So your first priority is to merge. Second priority, liquidate. Just liquidate the firm. And the third priority is to sell. Okay. So I think we use the Swedish data for that one. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So and again, we use the socio-emotional wealth argument as to why the choice of how you exit differs between family versus non-family control firms. All right, so another paper that is interesting, well, the one with Pasquale Berrone recently we have in the Journal of International Business Studies, is that when you look around the world, it's a meta-analysis of about 400 papers that we found on family firms all over the world. What you find is that some cultures are more supportive of family businesses than others, okay, which is kind of interesting. And that the cultures that are more supportive of family businesses, in those situations, the family businesses tend to do better. Okay, that's just a meta-analysis. It's an empirical thing. So apparently in some cultures, socio-emotional wealth tend to be more relevant, more important than in other countries. Okay? And typically what you find is that in the so-called Anglo-Saxon countries, socio-emotional wealth tends to be, for example, weaker than, for example, in the Latin countries. So in any case, it's an interesting paper in that we're linking there socio-emotional wealth with institutional theory and cross-cultural theory, and the overall environment where the firm is located. Okay. All right. So here is another picture. This is Goya. Goya, for anyone who being in the United States, I mean, Goya is they make a lot of Hispanic foods. Like frijoles negros, like black beans. It's very, it's a very large company. Originally from Cuba, and then from Cuba went to Puerto Rico. Again, it's a family firm. I think that's the Marriott group here. Well, the whole point of the pictures is that even when you look at big companies, you still find, typically, in many cases, you find that family ownership represents a major proportion of ownership in those organizations, even among the Fortune 500 firms. Okay. So the overall conclusion of all these papers is that the protection of socio-emotional wealth represents the main driving force of the behavior and the strategic decisions of family control firms. Okay, and then the behavioral agency model provides a theoretical foundation to understand the dynamics of these relationships. So we're looking at a whole set of variables that are very different from each other, from pollution to stock options, to diversifications, to acquisitions, to exiting the business, whole set of variables, to joining a co-op, and consistently you find those differences between family and non-family. And our argument is that the logic that explains those differences have to do with the role of the socio-emotional wealth in the family ownership context. Okay. And the conclusion, by the way, appear to be true cross-culturally. Actually, in a meta-analysis that we did in JIP's Journal of International Business Studies, we find that looking at 400 different papers across the world, that you find that to be the case no matter where you are. Okay? Whether you use Indian data, Pakistani data, Argentinian data, Swedish data, American data, you still find those differences. Okay? Even when it's true that in some institutional contexts, the family is less prominent. But even then, you still find a family effect. Okay? So whether you use American data or Swedish data, you're still going to find that the family effect. Okay? All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis, for a very interesting lecture.
Oh, thank you.
And I think we have some question from the audience. See where we have the microphone.
Thank you so much for a great lecture. You have certainly taught us that ownership matter, and it should preferably be family-owned. What new topics would you like to see regarding ownership in the management research field?
Okay. Well, you know, one interesting topic I think is, going back to what I said, in most of the larger companies, the family doesn't own 100%. It could be 20%, 5%. And one interesting topic, and we have starting to do some papers on that, to what extent the family can bargain with other shareholders. You know, right? Because if you have to bargain, if you have to share power with institutional investors, with the banks, with the government, okay? Like in many countries around the world, I mean, governments are a big owner. China being one good example. You know, how do you manage that relationship? And how is the family able to make decisions that are consistent with social emotional wealth when you have to compromise, you know, with other owners, okay? And I think that's probably the most interesting question that we really haven't looked at very carefully. I mean, as a matter of fact, I don't think we have looked at it, right, when you have to compromise, right? Because in most cases, the family is not the only owner. Okay? Once you get to be, definitely when you're publicly traded, you're no longer the only party having full discretion. You have to compromise, and that the whole dynamics there, you know, is very interesting. And we're actually doing a paper using Chinese data, you know, where, you know, the government may own 50% of the companies, and the family may own, like, say, 20, 30%. Multinational company may own another 20%. What effect does that have on things like pollution, for example? Okay. So I think that's the main thing that we have to look at in the future. That compromising, that bargaining process.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? Otherwise, I would like to thank you for your contribution to this research field.
Thank you.
And I will do this with a little.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So now we will have a brief break, and our next lecture will start 11 o'clock. And then it's time to listen to the exciting future of casting welcome back. Welcome back to our third open lectures from our honorary doctorates. And this session is going to be introduced by Professor Anders Jarfors from School of Engineering. Welcome, Anders.
Thank you very much. Well, the next speaker is Per Jansson with the Comtech company. And here we are talking about real collaboration as a foundation. Collaboration with Per has spurred project volumes of 240 million crowns in the last 10 years. We have a number of PhDs that have been produced in relation to these. So we have George, we have Mustafa, we have Bai Wei, we have ongoing students with Qing and so forth. So there's a massive amount of research that has been generated by an innovation from Jönköping University that has been taken up by Per, and that is what we're going to hear more about. I must also say that in collaboration for real, it has also generated one new foundry in Sweden, 2 new foundries in China, 1 research institute in China, and foremost, also a new business model for a family company. So this has not only created job opportunities, it has also generated new business modes and evolution of a family company. But this is not what we are going to talk about here today. We're going to listen to Per's journey from today till tomorrow, so to say, of casting. So Per, welcome.
You can go your own way.
To be here today. I'm going to talk about real casting and my journey to the future of casting. But before we start with that, we need to understand what real casting is. And in order to understand real casting, we need to understand a little bit about casting as such first. So we take a crash course in that first. Casting is important then what material you are casting in. I'm going to talk about aluminum because that is the material that we are working with. And what defines casting? Well, it's a process where you shape metal in liquid state into an intended geometry. This means that we are moving quite fast from raw material into final shape. Compared with a solid block, which you have to shape into your final component. This means that casting is a very competitive way of producing components, since it's a very short route from raw material to finished product. The downside with this is that the properties in a casting compared to a component made from a solid block is not really that good. And what methods do we have in casting then? Well, the main processes that we can see in casting is gravity casting, which is basically a die where you pour in aluminum and let the gravity become the pressure giver. Or you have low pressure die casting where you inject metal with as one can imagine when one hears the name, with a low pressure. Or we have high pressure where you pour in liquid metal into a chamber where there is a piston working and forces the metal between 2 die halves and then apply a very high pressure. These are the most common type of casting processes of today used for making components in the automotive sector and the telecom sector. And I would say that high pressure die casting are probably the one that represent the majority number of parts being produced. Semi-solid casting then, what is that? Well, there is a process then that you put in between the melt and the casting machine. And one of these are reo-casting then. And as I said earlier, casting is a process where you shape the component from liquid metal. But reo-casting is something where you don't do it from liquid nor solid, but in the state in between, the so-called semi-solid state. One can think on why do you want to do that? Because it's complicating things. Well, but when we are casting, the properties are so-so, but if we are shaping a component from a solid block, we can get very nice properties. And the idea here is to join forces of these two methods, meaning that we should get the high productivity from the casting, but the properties from the solid making. I guess that is the general idea. And we have different processes. We have GIS, which is a gas-injected semi-solid process. And we have SEED, which is a swirled enthalpy equilibration device. And we have the rheometal process. And it is the rheometal process that I'm going to talk about from now on. So what is the rheometal process? This is actually a very, very simple thing. You have a, let's see if I can get the laser. You have a piece of solid metal and you have some liquid metal, and you inject the solid piece into the liquid metal under rotation. This means that the liquid metal cools the solid metal is cooling the liquid metal, and the liquid metal is melting the solid metal. It's like putting a piece of ice into a cup of hot tea. And this then forms the material that we're going to cast, which we call the slurry. This is made through a machine which consists of a carousel of 6 stations, where you then cast your EEM and it rotates around, and the robot then uses the ladle to mix the slurry, and then before you pour it into the shot chamber in the die casting machine. You can here in this solution have different sizes, because you can change this gravity die, so you can have several different size of the EM, and you can in that way change the size of casting through different shot weights. So what are the difference then between liquid casting and semi-solid casting? What is the purpose of doing all this? Well, when we have a liquid material that solidifies, the microstructure looks like this. It's called a dendritic microstructure. It looks like basically a snowflake. You have a good example here. So when the material solidifies, it forms arms called dendrites. And depending on how fast it solidifies, the different size of the arms. These arms tend to get caught in each other during solidification, and it solidifies fast. This gives that we need to fill our final component with quite some speed, so we have time to fill the complete geometry before it solidifies. And the speed then gives you that we get a turbulent flow, meaning that the material is splashing, as you can see in this picture. And because the speed are so high during filling, we are talking about equivalent to 150 to 200 kilometers per hour. The metal enters this cavity, mixed with the surrounding air inside, so it's like a aluminum foam that runs at a very high speed into this cavity. This means that we get a lot of microporosities, small air bubbles in the material. This we try to prevent through a very high pressure. That's the name, high pressure die casting. To compress these small bubbles so we can't see them. Problem is that these bubbles is always there, even though they are very small, with the very high pressure inside. So how can we overcome this? With riocasting, we are changing the microstructure. So by injecting the small piece into the liquid, we are changing the microstructure into a globular structure, meaning that the grains is like small balls. So they can move much easier. So it does not require so much force of changing the shape of the material. That means that we will get a much more laminar flow, like here. So we don't have the same mix of air inside the part, which then give that we have much less defects inside. So that's the purpose of changing the microstructure from a dendritic into a globular microstructure. And that is what the riocasting process does. Aluminum, we say we cast aluminum. It's not really true. We cast an aluminum alloy, which means that we mix the aluminum with other materials. And the most common one that we mix with is silicon. And this is a phase diagram that shows on this x-axis here we have the amount of silicon and we have temperature here. The red line shows when the material solidifies. The V line here looks like a V. Above this here we have liquid material. And below the red line we have solid material. So we need to be up here when we do casting, right? Because we want the material liquid. In high pressure die casting, we want the material to be liquid as quickly as long as possible, because we want as much time to cast the component, because it solidifies very fast. That's why all the alloys used in conventional high pressure die casting is very close to this point, which is called eutecticum. It means that at a certain amount of silicon and at a certain temperature, the material goes from liquid to solid in a blink of an eye. Riocasting or semi-solid casting, all semi-solid casting methods actually, we depend on the distance from this line to the red line, which we call the two-phase area. So that means we have one thing that is different from riocasting and conventional casting. That means that we cannot have the same silicon content in the alloy in order to be able to do the casting. And this actually brings opportunities into the high pressure die casting, because we can cast alloys that have much better properties. And the summary, if we compare with high pressure die casting, we have, I said that we were filling about 150, 200 kilometers per hour inside the mold. We can reduce that drastically with riocasting. We have about 40% of the volume is already solid before we start casting. That means that these 40% does not have to become solid when the part have become its shape. So we have less material that need to go over phases. This means that the casting will hold much less defects inside, or the final component. Another benefit is that the temperature of the alloy or of the material being casted is approximately 100 degrees lower. That means we have a much less thermal stress on the die. And that could be interesting since the die costs like a German premium car. And another benefit is that we can use a smaller die casting machine, meaning that each foundry can offer a wider variety of components. So, Rio casting then tried to explain that it is a melt preparation process to high pressure die casting. The product that we do is this one. We call it a slurry maker. It's an add-on equipment to conventional die casting cell. We have a furnace here that holds the liquid aluminum. We have some robots that cast this little marshmallow or mushroom, the EEM. We have a robot that takes the liquid part, and this machine then does the mixing, changing the microstructure from dendritic with a lot of arms that clogs up to small ping pong balls that can flow much easily into the die. So, crash course in casting, Rio casting, on PowerPoint anyway. So, who am I? Per Jansson, I'm CEO and owner of Comtech. My background is a mechanical engineer. I have about approximately 30 years experience from the foundry industry. One of the first to adopt Rio casting in Sweden. I started my professional career in 1992 in a foundry that was founded by my father and my grandfather. Not so far away from Jönköping, actually 40 kilometers south of here, called in Skillingaryd. The company name was Stilexo. I have during this time worked in basically all positions in the foundry. I ended up in sales at the end. 2000, I was part of starting a subsidiary in China as a project manager for that, based on making components to customers in the telecom industry. 2002, the company was sold to new owners, to a Finnish foundry group called All Teams. And 2005, I was appointed managing director for this Swedish entity. So that's a short background of me. When I became responsible in 2005, I had seen a huge number of jobs disappearing from Sweden. From when we started the foundry in China in 2000, a lot of jobs were moving from Sweden to China. When we started the foundry in China in 2000, we were approximately 300 people working here in Skillingaryd. So a lot of thinking was made in how can we compete with the Chinese to keep the jobs here in Sweden. And in 2007, I came in contact with something new. It was said it was an invention that made aluminum not to solidify. A bit strong for a die caster to understand, because that is not usually our problem. And but after some investigations, I found out that the guy that had done this was Magnus Versén, and he was a professor here at the university. So I went up to meet with him and to understand what was it that he had invented. And it was this that was invented. What we see here is a liquid aluminum. You have a EEM that is injected during rotation, and you can see what is happening to the material. It's a little bit like whipping cream at home, right? And when you take out this material, which is happening when you do the casting, it is a little bit like spreading butter on your morning sandwich. So if you do this with equivalent with liquid aluminum, that would have solidified when it hits the table it's on. So it's huge invention, I would say. So I managed then to purchase a license from Magnus to start working with this technology, because I thought that this were the way how we should beat the Chinese. And we were working mainly with the telecom industry at the time, and the first project that we made was a telecom filter. A filter is that it's a mechanical device that filters the radio signal to a certain frequency. And well, it's a very complicated geometry. Let's not go into that, but a lot of machining is induced in this. All the holes are machined, a lot of milling and so on, which is the cost driver for this. So the task were to remove the machining and cast everything finished. Then we could compete with the Chinese. At least I thought so. And reocasting were the answer to it. So we made the part to the right, which had no milling. All holes were casted with the intention to assemble this part on the same bill of materials as so that don't have to change anything between. They can take in both parts. So went happy up to the customer, presenting this, showing a huge cost saving for them. Thought now we should give the Chinese a match at least. And then was a little bit disappointed because the customer said that, well, great idea, but we can't put you to competition. It's too high risk for us. So that was the first thing that we understood, that, okay, we have to do something more here. It's not just about the technical innovation. Second disappointment we had there then, basically the same time when this happened, was that the Finnish owner had decided to close the Swedish entity. We have moved so many jobs now already to China, so there was no profitability left in Sweden. So they wanted to close the business. And that was a blow, I thought. Now we have found at least a way to compete with them. And then so we did some investigations, checked around and so on, and then we managed to make a management buyout, meaning that we took over the Swedish entity. And the birth of Comtech was 1st of November 2008. And if we remember 2008 in the autumn, it was quite a turbulent period. All the forecasts were down, the automotive industry basically put on stop. So it was a turbulent time. However, we focused on the telecom market initially, and we had our first big project with the university at the time called RioCom. And that, I would say, were the start of this fantastic cooperation that we have had over the years and the years to come, I'm sure of that. This is also a telecom filter, the function in a filter is actually the air in between the walls. So the thinner walls you can make, the more air, right? And we had a target to see where is the limit of this process. And we all decided that a wall thickness of 0.5 millimeter, that is, nobody can do it thinner. And then the intention was to start with that and increase the wall and see where it starts to work. The problem was it worked directly. And they actually were 0.4 millimeter thick, so they were a little bit thinner than we thought. And then we had some money left in this project, so what to do with that? Well, we then casted all the holes as well, while we were at it as well, which are usually then machined. Another feature that is very interesting to the telecom industry is the thermal conductivity, which is a measurement how good the material is to transfer heat, we can say. And one major impact on aluminum casting, how good this material is to transfer heat and to affect the thermal conductivity, is the amount of silicon you have inside the alloy. And we actually casted this product with 1.6% silicon, which is very, very low, and I think it's some kind of a standing world record yet today with this geometry. Thermal conductivity. This feature is coming higher and higher on the agenda of today. The telecom industry and also the electronic industry, they are increasing frequencies, adding effects into their devices, meaning that we have more and more losses in these electronic circuits. And these losses spells heat. So we have to remove the heat from the electronics for the devices to work. And in order to take away the heat, there are different solutions like water. You can put in water cooling, fans that blow on things and so on. But if we can increase the thermal conductivity on the material, we can still have the same solution as we have today, meaning that it's a very simple solution. And we can still use this sustainable solution, so we don't have to put in water or adding fans and things. With reocasting, we are naturally able to reduce the silicon content, meaning that we can still cast these components and don't have to move over to other manufacturing methods, meaning that the reocasting supports a sustainable production. And we can also do this in secondary alloys. Secondary alloys is alloys based on scrap. Other production methods usually use primary alloys, and to produce a primary aluminum it requires quite a lot of energy to make the aluminum, which means that can we use secondary alloys, we are more sustainable comparing of introducing new aluminum. It also means that we can keep the production in already existing investments made. Since the production is a bolt-on thing, the production can continue in the same supply chain that is already existing. We can also offer to use smaller machines, meaning that the existing machine park in the existing supply chains can use the machines for new, bigger geometries as well. And we see a constant flow of new components being developed, especially in EV. I mean, electrical vehicles are coming up, and we see power electronics, battery cooling. Things like this is that putting the thermal conductivity on the agenda higher and higher day by day. So we had proven the technology in thin wall castings. What can we do about thick wall castings? We had some Swedish truck manufacturers that showed interest in the technology and had several components identified as good examples for this. The benefit from the industry should have been that they wanted to see if they could reduce or simplify heat treatment but have the same or better mechanical properties. We were part of the project Comcast here with the university, and parallel to this there were a development of 5 components for the truck industry. We can see 2 here on the pictures. Where to achieve this target where we could cast the parts with a simpler heat treatment and with the remaining mechanical properties. In this project we had a supplier to the truck industry that were supplying other commodities, not casting. But during the success of this project, the company decided to invest in the technology and invested in capacity of casting and started up a new greenfield foundry here in Sweden, which I would say is an astonishing thing to do. So basically this project showed that the technology holds what it promised also when it comes to thick parts. For large parts then that carry load, the fatigue properties are interesting. Components like we saw here is usually made from gravity and low pressure die casting, which I explained a little bit about when I started. But when casting in these methods, you always need to heat treat to get the properties that you need. And the most common heat treatment procedure is called T6. And for you who's not familiar with this, it means that you heat up the part close to melting point again and for some hours, and then you put them in water for cooling down, and then you age them for about 100, 200 degrees for a couple of hours. And then you have brought up the mechanical properties on the component. But when doing this process, the parts are bending, which means that you have to add a lot of material so you can correct the part afterwards in machining, which adds costs, of course, to it. So the idea here was that with reocasting, we can cast the part without this heat treatment and only do the aging, so we don't have the bending. We can cast the part finished. And we save also energy, of course, since we don't need to do the solution heat treatment initially. That was also proven in all of these projects that we have been doing over the past years. Despite all the findings that we have done in the projects, it has been slow on the market for us as a foundry. I couldn't really understand why. We show benefit by benefit by benefit by benefit. Why doesn't people want to buy this? We saw a turnaround, I would say, in 2019, because in the fall of 2018 we were approached by a customer that makes compressors. A compressor consists of 3 parts. We have one compressor, I would say, in all cars today. There's about 80 million cars made every year. And 3 castings times 8 million cars means a lot of castings are needed. These are made today by high pressure die casting. The problem is that in this system there is such a high pressure, and the high pressure die casted components are leaking, meaning that It can't withhold the pressure. And the common way of solving this is to do an impregnation process. You basically put it in a bin of polymer material and put pressure, so the polymer material goes into hollow things inside the casting and solidifies, and then you can use the part. And compressor production, you do this both 1, 2, and 3 times for each casting to get them tight. And this company that approached us wanted to see if reocasting could be the answer to get rid of this process. And we had very good results of we could produce leak-tight parts without impregnation. And during the final discussions with this customer, he said, okay, if we're now going to choose this method as our primary production method of this type of castings, you have to provide us with 10 production cells in 3 continents next year. And that's tough for a small foundry that operates 4 production cells. So it was clearly understood that we have to change something. It needs a new business model. We cannot be the only ambassadors for this technology, because then the technology will die. And the technology is too good for that. So we have to bring the technology to our competition, or our colleagues, if I say. So we started a new branch within our company, which we have named to TMS, the Technology Migration Solution. And that was to sell this machine to our fellow competitors. When that went up to the market that this is possible, we could see the OEM or the design owners had a big change in mindset. So during these 2.5 years we have put this on the market, we have made 150 plus feasibility studies of different applications where we see benefits from this reocasting. And then we all know what we have lived with in the past 1.5 years as well, a corona pandemic and so on. And that has also led to that we have taken the decision as a foundry to move away from foundry activities and starting to become more a technology provider, meaning selling process. So, since the 2.5 years, we have sold 16 machines to the market. We see market are starting to accept the process more and more. More applications are being tested, interest are growing. And we can see that the main reason for this is that we offer new materials with better properties, with same productivity as customers are used to today through high-pressure die casting. We can see that we offer possible quick ramp-ups, so that's not since it's an add-on equipment that can be bolted on to existing equipment, which are benefits for design owners. For the foundries, we see that we offer them new market applications that they can't cast today, meaning that they have more opportunities in the market with the existing investments they already have made in their foundry equipment. And we also introduced that they could quote larger components from these. So, however, I would say that the major advantage we bring to the market is that we can bring a more sustainable solution for the casting industry, which the foundry can bring to the OEM customers through reocasting. The fact that we can enlarge the possibility to use secondary alloys is a big benefit and replace primary. We introduce and have shown that also, that we can replace other materials such as iron, for instance, with aluminum, meaning we can provide OEM to make lighter products and through their final product make a more sustainable solution. and the fact that silicon is a big driver in the CO2 footprint for producing aluminum, and by just the fact by reducing that, we get a more sustainable solution. So I think that, in my belief, when the market is made aware of all these benefits, reocasting will grow and take the role of industry standard when it comes to high pressure die casting. And we have now worked with this process for the past 15 years, whereof 2.5 latest years we have basically seen the market react. And we have probably only discovered, what, 10-15% of what the potential is. So that tells me that we need more research, more findings, in order to spread this, because it's that good. And with this, I would like to thank all my colleagues in Comtech for the hard work and putting up with me. The university and Anders Jarfors team in their support, because without their work, we would never ever have been in the position we are today. I also would like to thank Magnus Wisén to believe in our way of working and let us to develop his idea into an industrial process. And finally, I would like to thank my father for allowing me to change his foundry into what we are going to be from here on, meaning a technology provider. So I look forward to future projects with the university here for many years to come. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Per, for a very interesting lecture. And listening to you, I understand that growing up in a family where I had to wipe off foundry sand
Yeah.
more or less my entire life for a couple of years is more or less the past.
Yeah.
So, what do you think will be of most importance for the foundry industry in the future?
Clearly, it is to provide sustainable solution to support the future development of the transition from ICE drivetrains into electrical vehicles, and that must be the focus on this for the foundry industry, as I see it.
And listening to you, it's really make it clear that we can't live without casting in some ways.
Definitely not.
No. Do we have any questions from the audience? Otherwise, once again, Per, thank you for what you have done for Jönköping University and from
Thank you.
us to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will take a short break and set up the stage for the last honorary doctor, and we'll meet again at 12 o'clock. Welcome back to Jönköping University. As you may know, we are listening to open lectures from our honorary doctors today. And we have one left, and she will be presented by Professor Sofia Källström from School of Health and Welfare. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm honored to introduce Tricia Greenhalgh as a professor. She is a professor of primary care health sciences at Oxford University, England, and she has a strong track record both in the area of research, education, and collaboration with the surrounding society. Trish has some academic roots from the social sciences as well as the medical field, and she is also a medical doctor. Characteristic for her research is that she has integrated and moved across these two fields in the health and medical area. And moving across different academic fields is one of the characteristics of her research. One of these interdisciplinary fields is the improvement science field, where Jönköping and Jönköping Academy and our university have an international reputation. Trish can be seen as an important female pioneer in this field. Trish has written over 450 academic publications, over 400 peer-reviewed papers, 16 books translated to 14 languages, Swedish one of those, 16 monographs and 21 books. That's quite impressive, and that could be inspiration for researcher. But it's not the publication per se, but also her way of improving practice and the world we are living in. Another asset of Trish's work is her ability to have a finger in the air and relate her research to urgent agenda of today. In 2020, when the pandemic hit us, she diverted from existing work in order to generate rapid findings to support pandemic responses. This new stream of research has included rapid evidence reviews, case studies, qualitative interviews with studies of patients' experiences. In the lecture today, she will reflect and address some of the roles of facts and research and the way they have played during the pandemic. Very welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I didn't hear the music very well, but the track I chose, and I think you heard, was Kirsty MacColl singing "There's a Guy Works Down the Chip Shop, Swears He's Elvis, and He's a Liar, but I'm not sure about you." And the reason I chose that track was because this lecture is about truth and lies and a lot of things in between. And I've called this lecture, Give Me Back My Fact. How can social science help us survive the post-truth pandemic? So let us begin then with a definition of post-truth from the dictionary. Post-truth is defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And it's actually more than a year since the first conference on post-truth and COVID was held. This conference was held on the 15th of June, 2020. That's a long time ago. It was, the pandemic's been going on for 18 months or more. And Roy Schulman, who chaired the conference, said this right at the beginning of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is a unique phenomenon constituting the most blatant expression of dangers of the post-truth age. the period of the pandemic has been characterized by less confidence in institutions, a lack of agreement on facts, and a blurring of the line between opinion and fact. And he said this a long time before the vaccines had been discovered and tested, before all the anti-vax movements, before the things that we now associate with post-truth and COVID. It was already evident early in the pandemic that there was something very post-truth about this particular pandemic. Now, when the vaccines were demonstrated to have worked, I think this was just after the very first trial results were revealed, President Trump announced that he'd developed them. I came up with the vaccines, and someone tweeted this. And in response to this piece of post-truth, I tweeted my own message. I'm on the front cover of Vogue, meaning any of us can make something up that isn't true. But within hours, someone had generated this image, which began to circulate very widely on social media, of me on the front cover of Vogue. And I think you can see from this example how easy it is in these days of graphic design and social media to generate something that isn't true and get it circulating as if it is true. Now, I recently set up, along with colleagues, a new Master of Science course at the University of Oxford. And one exercise we set our students, in fact, the very first thing we asked them to do is go and find a fact. And we also asked the students to carefully note the context in which that fact was generated and to bring it back to class, to defend it to your classmates. Now, I can tell you that no fact that is brought in by a student ever survives the scrutiny of the classmates unscathed. And it was interesting to see last year that many of our students shared a lot of assumptions which other students didn't share about what counted as a fact and what didn't. Now, this go and find a fact exercise was not my idea. It was the idea of Professor Steve Woolgar, Professor of Sociology, who published a book with the philosopher Bruno Latour, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, one of the authors of Actor Network Theory. And this book is subtitled The Construction of Scientific Facts. Now, it's about how social relations and norms in the laboratory mean that certain facts get discovered while other facts never are. Now, Latour and Woolgar took an anthropological approach in which they saw the scientists as a kind of tribe whose myths and rituals could be studied. As they said, some statements made by scientists appeared to fellow scientists more fact-like than others. This scientific tribe develops what's known as inscriptions, in other words, visual representations, diagrams, graphs, tracings of agreed facts, which then become stabilized as the way things are. So let's get back to social media and look at a few more claims that have been circulating. Here's one, you may have seen it on Facebook, or Twitter, or Instagram, it's done the rounds, and it's called Your Health, Your Life, Your Choice, it says. Know the facts before you wear a mask. Masks, it says, decrease oxygen uptake, increase toxin inhalation. They shut down the immune system. They increase your virus risk by triggering dormant infections. They're scientifically inaccurate because the virus can penetrate holes in the fabric, and they've not been studied in rigorous peer-reviewed research. Now, I decided to copy the style and symbolism of the anti-mask pamphlet. I constructed my own set of statements. I too headlined my pamphlet, Your Health, Your Life, Your Choice. Know the facts before you wear one. Masks, I said, have no impact on your oxygen intake, no increase in toxin inhalation, no damage to your immune system. They decrease virus transmission. The mesh size is scientifically accurate because viruses don't travel naked. And there's strong evidence of effectiveness when wearing masks to protect others. Now, unlike the original author, I could substantiate my statements, and I had searched for what scientists call disconfirming evidence, which would have prompted me to alter my interpretation. But the anti-mask pamphlet was more popular, at least with some groups. So on the right is a tweet from Scott Atlas, who at the time was President Trump's advisor on COVID-19. Now, Dr. Atlas, as you can see, isn't too keen on masks. And in this tweet, he cites three well-respected sources: the World Health Organization, the US Centers for Disease Control, and Professor Carl Hennigan from the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. Now, I'm sure that none of those sources would fully endorse all the statements in the left-hand graphic, but as Dr. Atlas says, all of them have expressed reservations about the limited evidence for the efficacy of masks in the context of protecting the public. So, as the title of this lecture implies, once you put a scientific claim into the public domain, you can't control who deploys it or for what purpose. Now, I want to introduce you to two very different tribes of scientists. And I'm drawing a little on this rather old book, actually, by Tony Betcher and Paul Trowler, called Academic Tribes and Territories. And I've shown the two tribes here with their traditional totems and war paint. The first tribe is called Evidence-Based Medicine, and its totem is the hierarchy of evidence, which I'll explain shortly. The second tribe is one that I've called Pragmatic Public Health, and its totem is the multifaceted real-world case study. And I've illustrated it here with this wonderful graphic from a Health Foundation report on domestic violence. Now, let's talk about the evidence-based medicine tribe. And this tribe adheres to this hierarchy of evidence. I'm sure you've seen a version of that before. It's got randomized controlled trials at the top, or perhaps meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. Now, in this tribe, good science is defined by the use of correct methods. Some methods are accepted by this tribe as better than others. Indeed, a poor example of a higher up method may be seen as better than a good example of a lower down method. And it is a deeply held myth amongst most members of this tribe that are randomized in an experiment that's good science, and if they're not, it's less good science. So here's an example of science produced by the evidence-based medicine tribe. Jefferson and Hennigan identified randomized trials of masks for preventing respiratory infections. They used a checklist called the risk of bias tool. You can see it on the right-hand side of this slide. Each research study is a row and each gets a score according to how biased they judged it to be. Now, using quality standards that were culturally agreed among their tribe, Jefferson and Hennigan concluded that there was no good evidence for the efficacy of masks. They placed all of the non-randomized trial evidence, everything below the red in the hierarchy of evidence, in a metaphorical trash can. And because this tribe ranks by method, they didn't even have to look at any other kinds of research. Thus was born the fact, in inverted commas, that there was no evidence that masks work. Now, looking again at Dr. Atlas's tweet, you can see what's happened here. It wasn't perhaps that the evidence-based medicine tribe was deliberately trying to mislead, but for reasons I'm going to go on to explain, I do believe that their assumptions did not serve them well in this particular example of constructing a fact. Now, let's look at a different tribe. It too has its totems and rituals. And since I myself identify with this tribe, I'm going to find it a little bit more difficult to be critical of it. The pragmatic public health tribe holds passionately to the belief that there is no universally applicable hierarchy of evidence, though some methods may be more or less fit for purpose. Good science is defined by this tribe as the use of multiple methods, adaptively and pragmatically, and also ethically and democratically, to build a nuanced narrative of what has happened in a particular real-world case and why. Theory is assumed to be at least as important as method. As Ken Judge put it, strong theory, flexible methods. The narrative, say the public health scientists, needs to make sense and be plausible to the natives. Now, in pragmatic public health, a lot of additional evidence gets brought to the table. Studies that were ignored by the evidence-based medicine tribe become salient. For example, sneeze videos in which the unmasked person is shown to emit huge turbulent clouds of respiratory droplets and airborne particles, or choir stories in which most people attending a choir practice developed COVID-19 even when they didn't get within 6 feet of the index case or touch any common surface. These pieces of evidence, taken in isolation, are not proof that masks work, but they demand a scientific explanation and they add to the overall picture. The same goes for natural experiments around the world. Christian Leffler's study of COVID mortality, country by country, in the days after the first documented case, showed that the countries which introduced mandated or widespread voluntary masking by 30 days, the blue and orange lines in this graph, had orders of magnitude fewer deaths than countries which delayed introducing masks beyond 100 days. Again, not in itself proof that masks work, but pretty good evidence that they don't kill you. Incidentally, concerns about harms of masks were not borne out. A review by Teresa Marto's team showed that risk compensation doesn't occur. Indeed, wearing masks is associated with increased compliance with other preventive measures such as physical distancing. And furthermore, video analysis of thousands of people walking past subway cameras shows that the ones wearing masks touch their faces less than the ones not wearing masks. Now, back in March 2020, while the World Health Organization was still trying to argue that COVID is not airborne, I got together with other members of the Pragmatic Public Health Tribe, and we wrote this article for the British Medical Journal. We argued, as pragmatists do, for the precautionary principle. We said we don't have 100% proof that masks work yet, but let's act pragmatically on the basis of the numerous facts which point in the direction of a positive benefit-harm balance. Well, that was in March 2020. By March 2021, scientists were still arguing about whether COVID was airborne. On the left is a paper by the evidence-based medicine tribe, Professor Hennigan and his colleagues, still published only as a preprint because it has not yet passed peer review. They argue that there's no definitive evidence that the virus is airborne. On the right is a paper by me and my colleagues published in The Lancet and peer reviewed. And in our view, we think that there are many different streams of evidence that the virus is airborne. The arguments against are few. There is, these authors claim, no consistent evidence of direct isolation of viable virus from air samples, nor, they say, is there consistent direct evidence of infection from humans who share air. The arguments in favour are more diverse and, in our view, much stronger. They include many, many super spreader events such as choir practices, concerts, funerals. I'm sure you've seen the examples. How could they have occurred unless the virus was spreading through the air? Evidence of long-range transmission, such as in quarantine hotels, where people never meet each other but share the air from a common corridor, and genetic testing of the people who develop COVID in quarantine hotels showed that it's the same genetic strain circulating among those hotel guests. Asymptomatic transmission, where people pass on the virus without coughing or sneezing, in other words, without producing any droplets. The fact that transmission of the virus is much, much more likely indoors than outdoors. the transmission of the virus between ferrets and other animals in cages that are connected only by an air duct. The fact that air sampling studies sometimes produce viable virus, sometimes they don't, but sometimes, and increasingly they do. That the virus can be found in air filters in buildings such as hospitals, and the only way it could have got there is through the air. And the fact that hospital-acquired COVID is very dramatically reduced by mask wearing among staff and patients. Now, the question of whether COVID is airborne has become highly politicized. Martin McKee and colleagues offer an analysis from political science that the libertarian right is anti-mask, anti-lockdown, and pro-segmentation. That is the idea that the old and vulnerable should stay at home in order that the young and less vulnerable can enjoy their freedoms. And that this basically mild disease should be allowed to wash over the population to achieve herd immunity. Jason Harsin, in a paper entitled Toxic White Masculinity, has argued that proponents of this view tend to be, although they are not necessarily, white and male, aggressively confident and hierarchical, and dismissive of traditional female traits such as emotionality, power sharing, and admission of uncertainty. COVID-19 has already changed fundamentally and perhaps forever how academic findings are generated, reported, disseminated, and shared with the public. This goes far beyond what Helga Nowotny and colleagues were talking about 2 decades ago when they introduced the concept of mode 2 science, that is, where facts are less certain and with a composition more heterogeneous, values more contested, methods more diverse, and boundaries more ragged. No, I think this is mode 3 science, a politicized and very sinister engagement with non-science by a poisoned and partisan society. We're no longer in Thomas Kuhn's relatively apolitical world in which those who wished to break with an old paradigm could simply take their football and go and play in a new field. We are in the world described by Michel Foucault back in 1966, a world in which knowledge, that is, particular versions of the facts, and power are intimately intertwined. Powerful people and powerful institutions can define what knowledge is and whose knowledge counts. As Foucault put it, in any given culture and at any given moment, there is always only one episteme that defines the conditions of possibility of all knowledge, whether expressed in a theory or silently invested in a practice. What Foucault didn't predict is how social media trolls would come to weaponize that dominant discourse. Now, I want to highlight 4 approaches that I and my team have been using to cope with the way our science has been caught up in these entanglements. The first is reflexivity. So the first picture is a picture of the River Thames near my house. Doesn't always look like that, I can tell you. Every morning I go there, often before it gets light. Sometimes I go for a swim, but I always take an hour away from my work to think. And one thing I often reflect on is my ethical duties as a scientist working for the public good and how I might best discharge those duties in the current context. Secondly, the second picture, not nearly so pleasant, is painful engagement. The only way that we can respond to what people are saying about us is to read it. We don't need to read every word, but we do need to know the ad hominems and the way that our facts and also our uncertainties about facts are being twisted by the trolls. Thirdly, epistemological labor, the work that we scientists have to do to expose particular paradigmatic assumptions and systematically challenge them. which is partly what I've been doing in this lecture. And finally, deconstruction, to overcome attempts to distort our findings. We need to literally take apart the words that people are using and the diagrams that they are circulating. And actually that Lancet paper that I showed you was actually put together by myself and my colleagues to deconstruct the claims that Hennigan and his team were making about science. And it's actually really quite difficult to, it's more difficult to challenge something epistemologically rather than simply say, well, you know, they haven't got their findings right. Once we start saying the philosophical assumptions are inappropriate, it takes a lot of explaining and a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to write papers, even short papers, which are deconstructive of other scientists' work. So I would like to thank you for your attention. And now I think I stop sharing my screen and I take questions.
Thank you very much for an inspiring lecture, Trish. And first, I want to ask if there are any questions from the audience or and no one in the chat? No? But I have a question for you, Trish. Because you have really highlighted the thing we have to struggle against as researchers, the life outside academia and the life outside writing research papers and really carefully investigating things. But what are your best advice for early career researchers who wants to improve practice and make a difference in people's lives with their research?
It's interesting. People often ask me what is my advice to early career researchers or PhD students, and I will come to that. But a few years ago, I worked at a different university, at Queen Mary University, and they were very progressive, and they invented a new role called the Dean for Research Impact. So it was a very senior role, and they asked me to do this job. And one of the things that I did in that role, so the idea is we need to make our research have impact outside the university. I did the usual things. I brought in policymakers to speak, and I, taught people how to listen to users, all that kind of thing. But I think one of the most important things that I did in that role was I changed the human resources practices. So every early career researcher in my university once a year gets an annual appraisal. And what the early career researchers told me when I was Dean for Research Impact is we can't get involved in impact activities. We can't leave the university and go and engage with the public or with industry or with policymakers, because every year we go for the annual appraisal and our line managers tell us we're wasting time. So what I did was I changed the form, and on that form now is a box, and it says what impact activities have you been involved in, and also on the promotion criteria from a junior researcher to a mid-career to a senior, the criteria include efforts to engage outside the university. So the reason why I answered in that way is I can give ECRs advice. I think they already know what they need to do, but they are not rewarded for it. And in fact, they are punished for it. So, and this is something that's very, very pervasive in academia. The idea is that you sit and you write your research papers and you publish them in the academic journals. But if you go off to a policy briefing breakfast and meet people who are not academics, or you give a talk to a school, or this kind of thing, then you are being lazy. And we need to change the culture. Harvard University actually requires its professors to spend 30% of their time outside the faculty. And Harvard is one of the leading universities that they have realized that we need to expect and reward. Okay, so what is my advice to early career researchers? there are a lot of opportunities now to leave your desk in the university and spend some time in a different environment. And the kind of opportunities we have in my university, you can spend 3 months working for a policy unit. You can spend 3 months in industry. You can spend 3 months with a charity, etc. And I would strongly encourage you to do that and get involved, because you will then understand the problem from the perspective of the people that you're working with. And you bring that perspective back into the university, and you will do a slightly different kind of research, or you'll publish it in a different place, or but you will learn it from the inside. In addition, I would strongly encourage you to bring non-academics into the university, so outreach and inreach. We have quite a few people actually from industry who spend some time at our university. And one of the things I haven't talked about today, but I've been involved in basic science research, developing new molecules which might become new drugs, for example. And when we bring in somebody from industry, they then start to say to us, look, your research is too sleepy, you're not oriented towards developing a commercial product, you know, that kind of thing. And so I think this cross-fertilization is very important. But in the end, the big piece of advice I would give the early career researchers is get your bosses to change the rules so that you get rewarded for doing this. And then it'll become much easier to do what you already know you need to do.
Thank you very much, Trish. And I don't know how I should say this, but we have one of the bosses here. I like to welcome Marie-Ernst Bravel, Dean of School of Health and Welfare, to say something to you. So you have your chance now, Trish.
Okay.
With you, Trish, because I am one of these persons who has spent half of my time in the municipality working as an elder strategist. So I totally agree. Everyone should step out the academia and do that. So I will work on that. But that's not why I'm here. I would like to thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. And I'm really looking forward to meet you in person, because I can see that we have a lot to discuss. That will be so interesting. You're not here today, but still we at School of Health and Welfare, we are very honored to have you as an honorary doctor here at Jönköping University. And I would like to symbolic hand over a gift for you. And it will wait for you here in Jönköping as a teaser, because you don't know what's in here. And I'm really looking forward to meet you here in Jönköping, both to hand over this gift to you, but also to continue this very interesting discussion that I think that we can have. So once again, welcome, and we are honored to have you as an honorary doctor here at Jönköping University. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted. I think I was measured for a ring, and I've only been measured for a ring twice in my life. The other time was when I was getting married 34 years ago. And I'm very keen to come when it's safer to travel. And I think we're planning in the spring for me to come over for a few days and spend time with some of my friends in Jönköping. Someone was talking about swimming in a lake, which is a big hobby of mine, jumping in cold water. So yes, I will be coming, and I'm absolutely delighted to be associated with your wonderful university and all the work you do on improvement science.
Thank you. There's a lot of lakes here in Småland.
So, thank you very much, Marie. And thank you very much, Trish. And as Marie said, we are really looking forward to see you. And we are also looking forward to see Suwait, who didn't come here today. But with that, we have come to the end of the day. After 4 very inspiring lectures, it's time to close this session. So thank you very much for joining us. But don't miss the formal academic ceremony tomorrow. It will also be broadcasted. Thank you.